Hey guys, Abel here with the Sustainable Self-Development Podcast, and in this episode I'm bringing you JC Deen from jcdfitness.com. He is one of those guys in the fitness industry who don't make a ton of noise all the time. They're kind of in the background, but they have been running very major fitness platforms for ages. I actually recorded this episode a long time ago, which I'm ashamed to say, but something rather unfortunate happened, which is that the computer that contained the audio got broken and it took a rather long time to get it fixed. So I'm glad that I could bring you this episode finally. So what you'll hear in this interview is a cool and interesting discussion about the mind games that one has to go through during fat loss phases and the best ways to tackle them, as well as something that JC coined the fat boy syndrome, which is about guys who were once fat in their lives or just fatter than they wanted to be, and now have a hard time committing to building muscle because of their fear of getting fat again. So if these topics sound interesting to you, then you'll like this episode, I promise. And a short plug, which I'll keep under 30 seconds. Join the Sustainable Self-Development Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/sustainable self-development and check out our SSD Nutrition and Training course, which encompasses the legacy and experience gathered over many years and coaching thousands of clients by strength coach Børge Fagerli at sustainableselfdevelopment.com. All right, told you it'll be under 30 seconds, so now let's get into the show. All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm really excited today to talk to JC Deen, who goes by JC. I wanted to have him on for a long time, and finally I managed to actually organize this interview with him. And JC is an author on various fitness-related topics. He also has a lot of cool stuff to say about habit formation and making this whole fitness game a sustainable lifestyle aspect of our lives, which is something that I like to talk about a lot on the podcast. So it's really cool to have him on. So with that, JC, thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So I wanted to ask you this off air, but how many years have you been in the industry?
Sure. So officially, I guess it's been 8 years now. I started my website in 2008. So I've been running that for 10 years, but I didn't officially start working with individual clients and training until about 2010 when I left. I was in college, but I also left a full-time job that I had, and basically I was in transition. I quit a job because of my college schedule, and then I just was like, all right, I've been writing about fitness for the last few years, made some connections, got certified, started working with people, and then I was just like, well, I can either go get another job or I can make this fitness thing work. So yeah, I've been working with individuals and taking the training part and coaching part seriously and making that a part of my profession since 2010.
Right. And out of curiosity, just because I know that a lot of people listen to this podcast who are kind of maybe fitness professionals themselves and maybe are in that boat that you were in back when you actually decided to dive into this kind of as a full-time gig for yourself. Like what were those initial few things that convinced you that this could be an actual business?
Sure. So first thing was I started my website in 2008, and when I did that, I kind of just wanted a creative outlet just to write about like what I know and share my knowledge and talk about what I was doing for training and nutrition and lessons I've learned and that type of thing. And the reason I started is because at that time, message boards and forums were really, really big. And this was before we had Facebook groups or most social media. So a lot of people were on message boards talking and sharing ideas. And I found myself learning a ton and also like giving a lot of advice. And then I met someone through the forum who helped me set up a website and helped me like learn the ins and outs of, basically writing content and building up content. And then I started to just write about anything that I was doing, whether it be my training or diets I was experimenting with or habits or lifestyle changes or whatever I was doing that pertained to my training and nutrition. And then I just continued writing, and then I started to kind of make some friends in the space through those message boards. And one friend in particular, his name's Roger Lawson, really good friend of mine. I met him through a message board. I actually don't remember where, but we soon became Facebook friends, and then in real life friends, and we met up and hung out, and we've been really great friends this whole time. I also made a connection with Alan Aragon way back at that time before he was very well known, and he basically encouraged me to keep writing, keep talking about training, keep working with individuals and coaching, and made really good friends with him. And then just basically through the online community, I had made some connections to other people like him and Raj, and just kind of started to get to know people that were working in the space through the internet. And then fast forward a year or two, I went to some fitness conferences. I went to the Fitness Summit in Kansas City, met Alan for the first time. Raj actually went, so hung out with him, met some other people for the first time, and it was incredible because it was just a big networking opportunity. And I ended up meeting a handful of other people through those people I met at the Fitness Summit. One of the other early people that I met through the internet, and I've still never actually met her in real life yet, but I still chat with her, is Lee Peel. And she was really big into the writing scene, the online fitness writing back in like 2010, 2011, and she still does it, obviously. But anyway, I would say the biggest thing that pushed me forward into this industry was whenever it was February of 2010. I was in college, basically working full time and going to school full time, and I had started. I'd gotten a certification. I've been writing about fitness online and kind of getting more traction in terms of like people seeing my stuff. And I had this situation where I was given a different schedule at work, and it completely conflicted with my school schedule. And so I was put in a situation where I either had to quit school and give up a scholarship, or quit my job, essentially. And so I just decided, I was like, I got money in savings. I need to get through the semester. Once I get through the semester, I'll figure it out, and then I'll either get another job or whatever. But I had a conversation with Alan Aragon over the phone, and he was like, hey man, I think you can really do this. I think if you just jump in with both feet and continue writing, continue honing your craft, continue training people, he's like, I think you can make this a full-time thing. And at the time it sounded really great, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to totally do it. And I kind of just went into it with blinders on. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I'm really glad I did it, because I now have a career because Alan kind of pushed me, over the phone. He was like, look, man, I really think you should do this. I believe in you, and you got a good message, and you can write. And he just basically gave me a ton of encouragement. So, that's pretty much how I got started. I quit my job in February just because of the schedule change. And then I just kept doing what I was doing, started working with people. I actually remember that spring, I actually started doing online coaching and consultations. So this is back in 2010, before online coaching was ever like really a thing at all.
Yeah.
And I just started doing. People would write to me and they're like, hey, I need help with my training and diet. I'm like, okay, well, pay me this amount and I'll give you a diet and training program, and we'll check in every week. So it's kind of like figuring out things before, figuring out the online coaching thing before it was even really a thing like it is now. And that's in a nutshell how I got started.
Perfect. Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I was just going to ask you how, if you look back at your approach and kind of the things that you were saying in the beginning, or what you were writing about, or what type of advice you were giving to people, if you contrast it with what you're talking about now and what you know now. Because you started out in 2010-ish, then like a lot of things have happened in the industry so far. The kind of the evidence-based fitness crowd has really exploded. And but you said that you started out with connections like Alan Aragon, so kind of that tells me that you kind of started off on the right foot to begin with. But when you look back at your work initially, do you see significant changes in kind of your message and how you think about certain things?
Yes, totally. So when I first started out, I didn't know that much, right? That was 8 years ago. And I knew way more than the average person just because of my background and what I was interested in and what I was reading and what I was learning about. But what I was writing about then, as far as training and nutrition, was a little different than what I do now. And I think that's par for the course. I mean, I don't know anyone that starts out doing something and doing the same thing 5 years later. And if they are, then they probably haven't really learned anything. So I would say the biggest thing that has changed is I just have a way more open mind now than I did then, because up until that point, I only had a certain level of experience. And most of that experience was through my own eyes, like just working on myself, not necessarily training people, not necessarily dealing with injuries or anything like that. So my experience and my scope was very limited. And that was just because of when I was in junior high and high school, I played sports and I understood weight training and movement through those mediums. And then, so I wrote from that perspective on how to train for size and fat loss and improving your performance, that type of thing. But then when I started to work with individual clients, I started to realize that the general population, the average person, was nowhere near where I was at that point, just because they didn't have the previous experience, right? Yeah. And so going through, kind of navigating that world in 2011, I think it was, or 2012, I forget, I get it mixed up. But anyway, I took a trip to New York. And I was staying with a friend, sleeping on his couch, and I sent a tweet to John Romanello. And at this point, I'd never really talked to him. I just had followed his writing and followed his stuff online, and when he used to write for T Nation. And I basically sent him a tweet, and I was like, "Hey man, I'm going to be in New York from these dates. I would love to get a beer or coffee or whatever." And when I was traveling in New York, I basically get a text. Let me back up. So he basically sent me a message on Twitter, and he was like, "Hey man, be glad to hang out. Let me know when you're in town." We exchanged numbers. So anyway, I get to New York, and the first day, I got there in the evening, stayed the night with my friend, woke up on the couch to a text message that came in at 6 a.m. And it was Roman, and he was like, "Hey dude, I think you're in the city now. I am going to train a client, but we should definitely hang out while you're here." And long story short, I ended up hanging out with him 3 times that week. We basically got to know each other, drank, ate together, spent time going over what we know, kind of learning about each other's styles. And we also outlined my very first product that I released as a digital product. And that was something I was really interested in doing because I've been coaching, I've been training people. Then I wanted to get into the online world of selling products. And so Roman was incredibly instrumental in that for me. When we basically sat down at a bar, and he was like, "Okay, dude, what's your hook? What are you going to do? What are you going to talk about? What are you going to write about? How are you going to approach this?" And it was a lot of questions that I hadn't really thought of before. And because I was just kind of going by flying by the seat of my pants at this point.
Yeah.
And it was amazing because he reached out to me and gave me his friendship pretty selflessly. And to me that was a huge point in my career, going through this space, because he was just a super genuine dude. He's a friend to this day, I've been to New York multiple times, spent time with him. We have each other's number, we text, we talk. Super cool guy, and I'm forever grateful for him. So, kind of circling back to the original question, my ideas and the way I approach things have morphed a ton, and they'll probably morph even more, 5 years down the road from here. But for the most part, kind of going back to what you said, the evidence-based crowd and evidence-based approaches has really grown. And I think there's a lot of good in that, just for the simple fact that if you go look up anything, 10 years ago it was go grab a magazine off the rack and look at how bad the advice is, right?
Yeah.
Or look at, what the claims are and, the truth behind those claims. But nowadays it's like, just Google something and see how much stuff that comes up that's just either incorrect or it's fabricated or straight out lies, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the interesting thing about the evidence-based approach kind of turns that upside down. And it's like, well, this is the claim. This is what people are saying will happen. And is this true? Does this line up with what we know scientifically? And there are a lot of faults to that view, but it's probably the best working model we have for now, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think it's really cool what the evidence-based approach in the community has done, right? They've taken the idea of, well, this is what makes muscle grow, or this is how fat loss works, or this is how macronutrients affect your body composition, whatever, and then they kind of put it under the scope, so to speak, and say, okay, are we making decisions based on some hunch we have, or are we making decisions based on what's in the research? And so, people like Alan Aragon, Lyle McDonald, various other people, Mike Israetel, there's a whole bunch of them, obviously. You know what I'm talking about, and I'm sure lots of people listening to this know. They're carrying a flag that, that is helping people see the truth and helping people see what's going to help them. And at the end of the day, we all want results, right? We all want to make progress. And let's face it, life is short, life is limited, and we should want to have a shortcut, so to speak. No one wants to do the wrong thing for 3 years and realize, oh shit, I've been doing this incorrectly the whole time. And that's why I think the evidence-based approach is really great. And it's also good too for helping people move efficiently and move better. Time and time again, when I'm at the gym, I see trainers who are working with clients and having them do things that are just dangerous or unnecessary. And, I don't fault them. It's not like, they may not even have access to the information that you and I have access to. They may not even know anything other than what they learned in their certification or what they've seen other trainers doing. So, I don't really fault them. It's just they're doing the best with what they know.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing about the evidence-based approach is if you see that side of the coin, you can ask the right questions, I guess you should say, is, this person wants to work on their quad strength and build their lower body. Well, we could do squats for that. We could do leg press, or we could do squat jumps, or we could do box jumps. But which one's the safest approach and which one's going to be the most effective? And if you're working with an athlete, box jumps are probably great for explosive speed and power, right?
Yeah.
But for the average person, it's probably not a very good idea. So anyway, wrap this up. I think the evidence-based thing is really great. It's something that we didn't really have access to so much over the last 10, 15 years. It's always been there, but it's not been so out in the open in terms of a marketing message, I guess. You could even call it that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and just as how you were saying that there's just a lot of misinformation, or certainly less over the years, but still it's sometimes it's tough to navigate between different sources of information, and that I guess maybe just as a segue to some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about today. Just yesterday in a language class that I was taking, my teacher was asking me in this language that I'm studying what my biggest challenge was on my fitness journey, and I was trying to explain it in this language that I'm learning. I said a couple of things like learning what matters, what really matters, and what doesn't matter. Learning that, I can eat out in a restaurant and I can eat something that initially wasn't a part of my plan and still make progress. And I was talking about these kinds of things. And if I was to ask you that same question, if you look back at your fitness journey, perhaps even on your career as a fitness professional, but is there one or two real big challenges that you can look back at that and say that overcoming that was maybe one of the biggest game changers that allow you to, still be in this game, both as a practitioner yourself. I mean, I guess you're still training and you're still on track nutritionally, but you're also a professional. Are there some key moments like this that come to mind?
Yeah, there are a handful. I would say the first thing that I realized that was a big thing for me was learning about the importance of macronutrients, just from a perspective of understanding how they work in terms of adjusting your calorie balance, and also just helping you to improve body composition, right? So I remember tracking macros like the first time I ever hired a fitness coach for myself, which was back in like 2006, 2000, yeah, like 2006ish. And that guy is actually still a really good friend to this day. And anyway, he helped me start to track and count my macros, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't really understand it up until working with him. And then that became kind of a big focus that people kind of switched to. They were like, don't focus on calories, focus on macros. If you focus on macros, you're gonna hit a certain percentage of protein, carbohydrates, and fat, and that's going to have a greater impact on body composition. So I think just going back and like learning how that worked for myself, and then helping clients understand how that works and why that's important, was one of the big things that just was kind of like a light bulb moment for me back when I was younger and thinking about this stuff. And then I would say another thing that really helped my own journey, and then also working with clients, was realizing that the idea of labeling food with like a moral connotation was just a disaster, and kind of a really short-sighted approach. And if you pay attention to, you mentioned language a second ago. If you pay attention to language, the language that you use gives a concept a certain degree of meaning or substance, right? So you can say, oh, I did really bad on my diet today, or I really messed up on my diet today, or I haven't been good. And like those words all, those phrases assume that there's some moral connotation to the way that you were eating, or the way that you selected your foods, or what you chose to consume, right?
Yeah.
And I found for myself, I kind of got caught in a trap of that, like way early on when I was kind of doing my own training in nutrition, that I would view foods as good or bad or whatever, and then I would associate them with a good composition or negative, bad body composition, whatever. And then I started to work with clients, and I realized that they had a lot of the same hangups. So like one big thing for me was helping people understand that, at the end of the day, food is mostly neutral. We can get into the idea and the topics of what foods are ideal for humans to eat, and what foods have the most micronutrients, and the foods that are most dense, and the foods that are going to be the best for us, and then what are really bad for us. Like we can get into all that from a nutritional perspective, but just helping people understand that at the end of the day, if body composition is a major concern of yours, then these foods you want to focus on. But if you decide you want to have some food out, or you want to enjoy something, or you want to indulge, that's not the end of the world. And oftentimes just changing your thinking about those concepts and how you view food can have a huge impact on your body composition and just your overall well-being and levels of stress. I remember I used to stress out a ton about not being able to track a certain meal, or not being able to have a certain food because and once I learned to kind of let go of those things and proved it to myself from an experiential perspective, then I realized I could I could let go of those old ideas, like those negative views, and I would say that's one of the things that I've helped a lot of my clients with. And once you get them over that hump, it's pretty neat to see them change and see them view food differently. Yeah. And I don't know, to me that's just really important, because I think food is so much more than just fuel for our bodies. It's cultural, and think about it like this: like for humans, one of the best experiences we can have is the taste and texture of food.
Yeah.
And even before we had all this industrial, heavily processed food, we could still create meals that were incredibly tasty and rich, right?
Yeah.
And you can probably relate to this, but I can think back to certain meals that my mom would make when I was growing up, like on Sundays. And they were just really, it was comfort food, right? It was really warming. It just gave you a lot of satisfaction. And sitting down to eat that food was super comforting. And it wasn't anything that was highly processed or packaged. I mean, it was normal, whole food.
Yeah.
But the way that she prepared it was really, really great. So, I think we need to move beyond, or I say we. I mean, I just think people in general, like I've helped people, my clients and myself, move beyond the idea that food is just fuel. And then also realizing that we don't really necessarily have to have a moral connotation around what we eat. We're not bad if we eat out. We're not bad if we don't stick to our diet 100%. And just the same way, like we're not being good, so to speak, if we never miss a meal. I think removing that whole moral connotation is the first step to experiencing more freedom and also just getting better results with the diet as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about viewing food just as fuel and as a source of enjoyment. I think over time, the way I came to think about this is that there's sort of a sweet spot that we want to hit. So food is more than just fuel. I mean, I think maybe for some elite athlete for whom literally food serves nothing else but fueling their performance, that can be true that food is just fuel. But at the same time, sometimes people contact me and they tell me that they feel guilty because they were trying to get into that mindset that they were just going to eat for physical reasons and they totally get the emotionality out of it. And they fail maybe or fall off the wagon, and then I'm telling them, food is a source of pleasure, and I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. I don't think that we should strive to get to this point where we derive no enjoyment out of food, but at the same time, we also don't want to swing to the other extreme where we are treating and comforting ourselves with food. So there's really kind of this nice sweet spot that we should aim at. Most probably, a lot of your clients are coming to you with fat loss goals, I would assume. That's a pretty common goal, especially these days that the weather is slowly warming up, I'm assuming. And, before our call a few weeks ago, you shot me over this book that you wrote, or ebook. What was the title?
Yeah, it's called Stay Leaner Longer.
It's basically, if I had to summarize it in one sentence, is basically taking you through the fat loss process and kind of the mental kind of challenges and battles that you have to overcome and to maintain your results. I mean, maybe I'm mischaracterizing it a little bit, but that's kind of what I've gotten out of this. And was this based on your own personal experience or challenges that you've seen your clients reporting to you, or how did this all play out, the birth of this book?
Yeah, so this particular book was a product of sitting down with a friend of mine, Rob Hanley, about 3 years ago, and we were in Croatia, and we had kind of talked about like what are the biggest things that my clients struggle with, right?
Yeah.
And I wanted to write something that was different than anything I've written before. A lot of my content and like my other products and ebooks that I've written, it's mostly the how-tos and the what to do, how to do it, why it works, right?
Yeah.
So here's how to set up your diet for fat loss. This is why it works. Here's how to do it and execute, right?
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, like there's nothing wrong with that information, and there's a lot of that information out there. What it all comes down to is just doing the work, right?
Yeah.
Either you do the work or you don't do the work. Like emotions aside, you either stick to the plan and create the habits and make it work, or you don't, and you don't get the results you want, right?
Yeah.
But while that's really simple and really sharp, like those ideas, that's not the case when you're working with human beings, right? Like everyone has a certain level of discipline that they've been able to implement over their lives. Everyone has a different background, different history, and we all tend to internalize things based on our own personality or based on our experiences, right? So I wanted to write something that was a little bit different from a psychological perspective. And, just for anyone listening, I did major in psychology. I don't have any like formal background or anything in like, sociological or psychological sciences or anything like that. But, just reading various books about the mindset that we have and mentality, and also thinking about how we make decisions and like how our behaviors are set up based on either our environment or based on what we learned. I started to get really interested in, how could I get my clients to stick to their diet? How can I get my clients to focus on the thing that they need to be doing? And so I started brainstorming why clients end up failing, or why they give up, or why they don't stick to something for long enough to finally start getting the returns. And so the book is basically broken up into two sections. The first section is everything that people tend to struggle with. And we all deal with one or more of these issues, and I call them the perils in the book. And there's 6 of them. And all the feedback that I've gotten from this book over the last 3 years that it's been out, time and time again, like I've just heard people say, wow, this is like you wrote this for me. I could relate to X, Y, and Z, what you wrote about the perils. I could totally see myself saying these things to myself, or I can totally relate to blah, 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 whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so getting all that feedback made me realize I hit a nerve, and people could really relate. And to sum it up in a nutshell, I mean, the book it contains no training information, no diet advice, even though it's called Stay Lean or Longer. There is, and I tell people straight up, like, you're not going to learn about how to lose fat. You're not going to learn about what macronutrient split is you need to eat to optimize your performance or improve your body composition. But what you will learn is why you've failed over and over and over, and how you can actually overcome those things you've experienced. So to give this a little bit of a foundation and not be so abstract, for instance, a couple of the perils that I talk about, like the very first one I talk about is unrealistic expectations and what they end up doing, what they end up doing to a person, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a really quick example. You go on Instagram and you're following your favorite fitness person, and they decide to do a client spotlight, and they show a crazy dramatic transformation. And since humans are very visual, we see things, we process things visually, and a lot of people actually learn best from a visual perspective. So they see this before picture, they see this after picture, they see this person who was overweight, and then they see someone 30 pounds later with a picture to the right, and now they have abs and they're smiling, and there's all these subtle messages going on, right?
Yeah.
So they see this, and in their head, they come up with this idea of like, oh, wow, like if I just do X, Y, and Z, I can have the same transformation. And sometimes that is 100% true, but a lot of times it's not. And what happens is, when you see that before and after picture, you don't know exactly what that person went through. You don't know what the circumstances were. You don't know what they were dealing with. You don't really know anything about that person. And, I use transformation pictures in my marketing because it works. It helps people see what's possible. But one thing I do try to be very open and honest about is, you are not that person, right?
Yeah.
And you may see things in a certain way that maybe you can have a similar transformation. There's no denying that you can't, but you also have to have the realistic expectation about what's going to go into doing that work. And where I think a lot of people go wrong, and we can blame fitness professionals for marketing in this way, is we tend to oversimplify the process and make it sound really, really easy. And one thing I always like to tell people is transformation is a simple process, but it's not easy. Yeah. And so there's a huge difference in the way you phrase that, right? So it's simple, like to us, we understand what's going on. You basically need to eat in a certain way. You need to track your macros. You need to be really on point with your diet, and you need to not miss a training session. And you need to train hard. You need to get enough sleep. All these things are actually very simple. But when it comes down to actually executing and doing it, it's not that easy. Especially if you haven't been doing it, or you don't have that discipline built up over time. So the very first thing I mentioned is unrealistic expectations. People tend to think they can achieve a lot more in a short period of time, and it creates these ideas that ultimately will backfire.
Yeah.
Second peril is it's called "What's the Cheat Code?" and searching for shortcuts. And really simple thing here is we are conditioned to go look for the shortcut. We are conditioned to go look for the easy route. That's why supplement industry, especially the diet and fat loss supplement industry, is multiple billions of dollars a year, because people would rather pay $90 for a bottle of pills than pay $10 for a book on Amazon that will give them everything they need to do, from training, nutrition, everything, and actually implement that, because the bottle of pills is a way easier option, right?
Yeah.
It's way less friction. But the problem is the more you search for those shortcuts, the more you try that out, the further you delay the results, right? But just as human beings, we're conditioned to do that. We're conditioned to look for the short road. Like, we want things to be easy. Another peril is information overload. Now is worse than it's ever been. All you got to do is open your phone and you have a ton of information at your disposal. The problem is, though, is the more information you gather, the less you actually tend to do with it, because you become paralyzed from a standpoint of, what do you do? If you have 10 different, JCs, or 10 different Abels, or 10 different Romans telling you online, this is what you need to be doing, who do you listen to? Who do you trust?
Absolutely.
And so this leads into the next issue, which I call shiny object syndrome, where you get distracted over and over and over. Oh, I'm going to try this workout for 2 weeks. If I don't really see any results, then I'm going to try something else. And what happens is that person starts out good for the first few days, and then they fall off the wagon for 2 weeks, and then they say, oh, well, that program didn't work. When in reality, they didn't do anything.
Yeah.
They just worked out for 2 days, and then they took the next 2 weeks off. And then they go looking for the next one, and then they look for the next one. And then 6 months later, they look the exact same. They haven't made any changes, and then they feel really bad about themselves. And then that leads into what I call the negative feedback loop. So you do all this stuff over and over, and you never get results, and then you just look back at your failures, and then you just automatically think, well, I'm just a failure. I'm just going to keep screwing up. And then I have some more stuff that I talk about in the first section of the book, but basically those are the issues that people tend to deal with. And then the second part of the book, I basically give a blueprint on how to not fall for all that stuff. And I give you a strategy and a framework. And I talk a lot about habits and why habits are really important and what habits are. And, to this day, like, we use habits in our daily language, like, I can't quit smoking, it's a bad habit.
Yeah.
Or I always interrupt people, like, it's just a bad habit. There's all these like things that we use, but we don't necessarily understand what a habit is, right? We realize, like, on a surface level, it's this thing we do all the time, but we don't necessarily think about what habits are and how to actually change them and create new ones to improve our lives. And so I use the second section of the book to really dive into that and help people understand that. And then, the second part of the book is pretty much all about habits and, like, how to implement them and how to deal with replacing bad habits. And then I follow it up with, basically like an exercise of how to figure out if what you're working on is worth working on, and if you don't have a big enough reason why you're doing something, like if you don't have a big enough reason as to why you want to lose 50 pounds, then you're probably going to fail. And so I help people dig a little deeper and figure out why they actually want to do that. And then once we create a big enough why, and I do this with my clients too, once we determine a big enough reason why that we want to do something, then that becomes the pain that we want to avoid. Mm-hmm. And it really kind of sucks that we choose as humans, like, we would rather avoid pain than pursue pleasure. And I mean that long term. I don't mean that short term, because we always pursue pleasure in some form, but that's usually like really small stuff, like grabbing the ice cream instead of cooking a meal that would be healthy for us. That gives us an instant fix, or looking at our phone every 10 minutes instead of focusing on something that we need to work on.
Yeah.
But when it comes to, like, creating goals, like, we would rather avoid the pain and work against avoiding that pain, or work towards avoiding that pain, than trying to have, a 6-pack abs on the beach.
Yeah.
And, kind of sucks, but that's just the way we work. So I hope people understand why, and then how to structure and set up your life and your training and your nutrition, and also, like, build those habits that you need to have in place to stick to the process of doing what you need to do, instead of just saying, okay, I want to have abs on the beach in 6 months, now I got to figure it out.
Yeah. No, that's amazing, and definitely what when you said that people who read that said that as if you were just talking to them. I definitely, when I read this through, I was nodding a lot, and just reminded me a lot of my earlier kind of trials and tribulations as I was for my first initial failed trials to try to get down to six-pack level leanness. It's really interesting that the cheat code part and the information overload and also the shiny object syndrome, I think those all fundamentally come down to something that especially guys like myself and who are not genetically very gifted in this game, I guess there's just, even when we know a fair amount, there's just a small part of us that is always hoping to find that thing that we can tweak in our training and nutrition that will allow us to all of a sudden wake up looking like whoever, a Matt Ogus or a Jeff Side or someone like that. And until we actually get out of this mindset, we are pretty much just doomed to fail. And it's funny you mentioned supplements. I think it doesn't just manifest itself in trying to look for supplements as kind of the magic bullet, but even when someone looks up the workout regimen or the exercise recommendations of some guy who has a really impressive physique, they're still kind of in that mindset that, okay, if I'm just learning from this guy how to rotate my arm while I'm doing a chest cable fly or something, then my physique is going to explode to the next level. And yeah, I think the way you just laid this out is just really incredible. And the other thing that really hit home for me is kind of figuring out your why, which kind of sounds like this very woo-woo personal development kind of concept. But at the same time, a lot of guys fall into this trap of going through, for example, a cutting phase for 12 weeks. They're really crushing it. They rock on and everything is on point. But at the end, when they arrive, they just have these expectations of what's going to happen. And a lot of people are kind of not necessarily in it for the wrong reasons, but are in it for reasons that are just not reflecting reality, like getting laid or whatever, having this amazing success and being on the beach and having all these eyeballs from other people. Those things just are not really happening. So yeah, I think just the way you outlined it, I think a lot of people will feel like that you're talking to them through this. And with that, I would be curious, like as you were writing this and you were thinking about this concept, were there any particular ones that you particularly fell for again and again when you were going through your initial stages of transforming your body?
Yeah, sure. So the biggest one I fell for was probably the information overload.
Oh yeah.
Information overload, and so I've struggled with these things, but even to this day, information overload is one of the biggest issues, and not so much with fitness or nutrition stuff for me anymore. Not to say I know everything, but just because I understand it enough to realize what's bullshit and what's useful.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, information overload was a big issue. And I mean, this was 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, that time frame. And that was before we had such a wealth of information at our fingertips. There was no Instagram, there was no Snapchat. There was, Facebook was online, but it was not what it is today. Finding fitness stuff was still really easy, but it came through message boards and various other portals instead of apps and the way that, things that we do now. But yeah, I mean, that was my biggest thing that I struggled with from a perspective of transformation, and it was mostly because I was always second guessing what I was doing. Is my coach telling me to do the right thing? Do I trust him? Well, I do trust him, but this other person says their program is the best thing ever. And then I would kind of get lost in that for a while, and then I would end up saving all this information. In fact, I would have Word documents and bookmarks, tons of shit that I've saved that I haven't, I just wouldn't open again, right? Yeah. But I would save it because it was I may need this later.
Yeah.
And in the case I would find something new, I would read, and then I would save it, but I wouldn't actually do anything with it, right?
Yeah.
And this is even worse now. From an information perspective, I mean, it's insane. And as somebody who's a content creator and somebody who writes with a purpose on getting people's attention and educating them and helping them make a decision to do something with their training and nutrition based on my information, it's really, really difficult sometimes to write in a way that helps people understand like what they need to do, right? What I mean by that is like, someone can either land on one of my articles that is 3,500 words and they can read it and absorb it and get what they need, or they can open up Instagram and read some caption with some photo of, a dude or a girl doing a mirror selfie talking about, like, honestly, the stupidest, most inane thing that makes no difference to the world on transforming your body, but it's a short caption. It's like 100 words or whatever.
Yeah.
And they can go to that, and then they can feel good for a moment. They're like, oh man, like I'm on the right track. I'm doing the right thing. This person said I am, or whatever. Yeah. And it's really a struggle as a content creator, but also just like from a user's perspective, right? Like getting the results we want is going to take work in some form or fashion, right? It's going to take work as far as like reading and understanding the material, getting in the gym and actually training hard. And it's always easy. It's always easy to pick an easier option just because there's so many pieces of information out there. But a lot of times that information just doesn't give us what we need, right?
Absolutely.
And one way I struggle with this now is not necessarily in the fitness space, but like when it comes to like material that I am studying or learning, for instance, that pertains to my business. There are 100 million different things that I can read and study, but what it comes down to is picking one or two things, studying it, and then implementing it. And ultimately, that's the name of the game, right? Like, get your focus as narrow as possible, nail the things that you need to nail, and then cut out 98% of the rest of the stuff, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's actually really funny that you mentioned that because, just like you said, even when someone wants to become a business owner, content creator, there are many different approaches. I just read last year or the year before, I read this book, Deep Work from Cal Newport, which is basically the antithesis of a lot of the things that successful content marketers and kind of business coaches and people, Ramit Sethi or Neil Patel, a lot of what these guys are talking about, it's in many ways, it's the complete opposite of what they're saying. And the funny thing is that in many cases, these people, like I know, for example, Ramit Sethi and Cal Newport are good friends. They're in many ways saying things that are contrary to one another. So which one do you actually implement? And it very much is similar to what you need to do in fitness. Basically, at some point, you need to stick to one recommendation or one piece of advice, even realizing that might not be the absolute best thing that you could do in an absolute sense. But if you stick to it, it will be guaranteed much better if you program hop, or in this other case, I don't know, strategy hop. It's really interesting how that works out. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is kind of to transition. Well, we didn't discuss the fat loss side of things in great detail, but one thing that I've heard you writing about multiple times is how do you call it, the former fat boy syndrome? Mm-hmm. Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit? Because I found your perspective really interesting on that one.
Sure. So it's kind of funny. When I wrote that article, I don't know, I think it's like 2009 or something. Mm-hmm. I wrote it from a perspective of like my own personal struggles, right?
Yeah.
And what I think is really interesting is, so when I was growing up, I was never obese. Like I was never to the point of obesity, but I was really chunky growing up. And so much to the point that it affected me negatively. Like I knew I was fatter than all the other kids, right?
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on me, and it made me see myself in a way that I just didn't like myself, right? And it was it was especially noticeable like during the summers. I mean, I would like swim. I would like swim with a shirt on, and while all my friends like had their shirts off,
Yeah.
And I was super self-conscious about it. And I remember as a kid telling my mom, like I don't want to be fat anymore. Like I want to go on a diet. And my mom obliged, and she was like, okay, well, here's a diet that I got from the doctor, and it's a food combination diet, and you need to eat 3 or 4 meals a day, and every meal needs to have this food and this food and this food. And I remember, having the piece of paper in my hands, and I'm like, okay, I can do this. And like the first meal was like I don't remember, like a piece of grapefruit and a can of tuna or something. And I popped open the can of tuna and it was just like I gagged. Like I hate the smell of canned tuna. I just can't stomach it. I hate it. And I remember like trying to eat the tuna. I don't know, I was like 10 or 11 and I was like, I can't do this shit. And I remember like starting the diet and then 2 minutes later being like, okay, I can't do this. This sucks. And, but I still hated like how I looked, right?
Yeah.
And even like growing up, I would buy clothes that were like 2 times the size that they needed to be. And my shirts would like hang down to my knees. Mm-hmm. And my, I would buy like, like I would wear athletic shorts, and those shorts would like hang down past my knees. Yeah. And the reason I wore these big clothes is because like I thought it was covering up the fact that I was fat, right?
Yeah.
And so this carried on up until, through my adolescence, probably until like I was 13, 14-ish, and then I started to get active in athletics. And then that was what really changed my body, because I was active, going through puberty, obviously, but I was really active and, excuse me, and started to, train and work out and run and play sports. And so by the time I got into high school, I was a pretty decent athlete. I was, starting the football team, and just like, it was a really big part of my identity. And I lost a lot of my baby fat, or whatever you want to call it, but I still was like kind of on the chunky side. Like I wasn't overweight, I wasn't like super fat, but I also didn't look like my peers, right? I wasn't like a lot of my peers were just really skinny, right? They grew up skinny and naturally had abs, and like I remember being in the locker room and I was like, man, my body doesn't look like theirs, and then I kind of struggled with that, on and off for that period of time all the way through school. And then I got into college, and I went through this, I was still working out, I was still training, still lifting weights. So I was still working out, I was still training, still lifting weights. So like I fell in love with weight back at like that experience. I didn't actually really love playing football. Like it was fun, and it was like the camaraderie was great, and all that was really, really like good for me from an athletic perspective. But I really enjoyed the weightlifting aspect, and like if I could go back in time, like I probably would focus way more on training and like maybe even try to get into like powerlifting or something. But anyway, like that was a huge point in my life that started me off on this journey. But anyway, so when I got into college, make a really long story short, I made a bunch of friends really fast that first semester, freshman year. And, we would meet each other in the gym. We'd see each other in passing on campus, and we all like to work out. And so every year, these guys that were older than me, they're like, hey, we're going to have a best body competition. We're all going to put $50 in. We're going to have first place through third place. Whoever wins is going to take home some money, and we're all going to see who can get as ripped and shredded as possible by December. So this is like mid-September when we're all talking about this. Mm-hmm. And I'm like sitting in like a Denny's or a Waffle House at like 10:30 at night with all these guys, like stuffing our face full of food, and we're all talking about this. And I was like, I remember sitting there like grabbing like this huge amount of fat on my stomach. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, this is my first time, and I'm actually gonna like get in shape and like see what's underneath, Mm-hmm. And long story short, middle of December, I've lost like 35 pounds. I am leaner than I've ever been in my life. I'm seeing this physique that I never knew that I had. And it was just the most amazing like experience that I ever had from a physical transformation perspective. Mm-hmm. And I got second place, took home like $300.
Nice.
And it was amazing. Like it was the most like confidence boosting, ego boosting thing I could ever do. And it made me realize that I was in control of my outcomes. And that gave me a really positive outlook on what I could do. And that ultimately is what set me down this path of getting into this industry. But going back to the article that I wrote about former fat boy syndrome, was even though I was really lean and like all these people around me were like, holy shit, dude, like when I saw you start out on this journey, you were this chubby, like ex-football player, and now you're like this really lean, like fitness person.
Yeah.
And I remember like being in the gym like a couple weeks after the competition, and like like the guys are in there, they're walking in and they're like, dude, man, like you still look amazing. Like you need to maintain this. You need to nail this. Like just keep improving, like keep building your body. And it was such a good feeling. But when I would look at myself, like I'd get out of the shower and I'd like look at myself and like I still saw this like fat person, right? Still saw this chubby person. And that stuck with me for a long time. And then I ended up writing about it, called the former fat boy syndrome, where, there's two aspects. Like you get into good shape and you realize that you're in good shape and all these people are giving you the feedback that helps you understand that you've made this transformation. But you still see the fat person in the mirror, but then you also struggle with improving your body further. Yeah. So what I mean by that is pretty much every former fat boy, like, I don't mean that in like a condescending or a negative tone. I'm just saying, like any person that's previously been overweight is going to have a negative idea or a negative feeling when it comes to gaining weight. And the biggest thing I struggled with was I got to eat more. I've got to eat more to gain muscle. Like I've got to put on some more size, I've got to, I want to improve my body. And it was such a struggle to make myself eat more because my biggest fear was going back to that former fat boy self. I didn't want to go back to that place. I didn't want to be there again. Right. Yeah. And so I wrote the article and I got a ton of feedback and it was amazing. Even to this day, people are like, wow, that's how I found you. And that's how I continue to follow you. And, I could totally relate to that former fat boy syndrome idea because I'm a former fat boy. Mm-hmm. And it was really cool. And then even Men's Health a couple of years later, like reached out to me and they're like, hey, would you want to do an interview? And we want to talk about this, body image stuff. And they even like, it's funny, like they say that I coined the term, like, I don't know, it's kind of funny. It's kind of a claim to fame, I guess. But, but yeah, so like I don't know. It was just an interesting experience. And like, I just wrote about it, and people ended up, really gravitating towards it and they really resonated with it and it gave them hope too, and like, that's one thing I really enjoy about it. Cause like guys will come to me and they're like, I'm really struggling with the fact that I was fat growing up and I got in really good shape. And now like, I'm scared to eat. And in fact, I had a guy through Instagram, send me a message a couple days ago. He read one of my posts about like building muscle and bulking up. And he was like, I'm so afraid of adding any body weight at all that I constantly self-sabotage. My trainer, and he's telling me this, he's like, my trainer wants me to eat this amount, but I'm afraid to because I see the scale jump up a pound or two and I feel like I'm just going to be super fat again. And that's such an irrational thought. You're not going to regain all the 30 or 40 pounds you lost in a week's period of time. But humans are not rational beings, right? Like we mostly go with our emotion. We like to think we're rational, and some of us can be rational, but for the most part, we're not objective. We can't be objective to ourselves. We can't look at ourselves from an outside perspective and say, oh, this is good for us, or oh, this is bad for us, because those emotions will override it and say, you know what? I saw the scale jump up 2 or 3 pounds. I got to go back and start eating at a deficit again. And guys do this. It's probably a surprise to a lot of people. It might be a surprise to people listening to this that, this happens for guys a lot more than we think. Yeah. Guys just don't tend to talk about it, right? Like I rarely see guys in my Facebook group. I have a private Facebook group with about 1,000 of my regular readers, and it's really supportive. And I very rarely see any men talk about their issues with like a fear of weight gain. And I think that's just mostly due just because like they just don't talk about it, right? Yeah. But a woman might come in and say, hey, I'm doing, like recently I released a free butt builder program for women, and a woman came in and she was like, hey, I'm like struggling, like the scale's up 2 pounds in the last 5 weeks, and I'm really like worried that I'm just gonna like, I'm really worried about the weight gain. And then, I talked to her a little bit and I'm like, okay, look, like, well, are you tracking your measurements? Are you tracking your food? Did you eat something the last few days that maybe have made you bloat a little bit? And then she's like, yeah, actually I went out to eat with my friends, and that's when I stepped on the scale the next day, and the food was really salty, so I'm actually more bloated than I normally am. And it's one of those things that, like I think men just struggle with, but it's kind of silent, right? And it's just because men don't really talk about this shit. Like men don't talk about their emotions or talk about how they don't want to feel fat or whatever. Yeah. And But anyway, I just thought it was really interesting that, a lot of men could relate to that. And like privately, men have sent me emails and they're like, your former fat boy syndrome like was so amazing. Like it really helped me understand like where I was struggling and what I needed to do to fix it and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah. No, I think, though I think more people can resonate with that than what we would initially think. And yeah, I can definitely even myself relate to that whenever I would finish a cutting period and would get lean finally. And yeah, there was always that initial haze where I just didn't want to let go of the hard-earned results that I finally achieved. And I guess there's a time and a place for just enjoying what you achieved and maintaining that, and over time realizing that, if you want to improve even further, then, you should probably go in a muscle building phase, and that will accompany some fat gain, but also probably there's some power in recognizing the fact that, building muscle, gaining weight, and accepting some fat gain in the process doesn't mean, blowing up into a fat mass and just dissipating and letting all your results that you worked for dissipate overnight. So, yeah, very cool. JC, I think I kept you up for a good while, and I think we managed to drop a lot of cool concepts and knowledge bombs for people. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Maybe just let our listeners know where they can find this book that you talked about and any of the resources that you would like them to check out.
Sure. So best place to find me is just jcdfitness.com. That's the best place to find me. You can also find that book at stayleanerlonger.com, but you should be able to find everything from me just on my main website. Another place you can find me is just JC Deen on Instagram, JCDEEN. I'm pretty active there, and if you want to join my Facebook group, it's totally free. Just get in touch with me.
Perfect. All right, JC, thank you so much once again for doing this. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode and liked what you heard. And if you did, then I think you'd definitely love our SSD Training and Nutritional course that we recently put out with Børge Fagerli. This program not only contains a 12-week phasic training program that you can use to time efficiently and safely build the best body you can, but also gives you 4+ hours of video lectures about managing your nutrition and lifestyle to not only look good, but feel and perform optimally. And besides this, you will also be getting some really awesome bonuses like Børge Fagerli's MyoReps and Zero Carb ebook. So if this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and check out sustainableselfdevelopment.com. And of course, to not miss out on future episodes like this, subscribe to the podcast and you'll be up to date on everything we'll be putting out. So thank you for hanging around up until now, and see you next time.